My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 42 years old and I've spent the last 20 years climbing the corporate ladder at a firm where loyalty was currency and trust was everything. I wasn't the loudest voice in the room, nor the one who chased recognition, but I was dependable, sharp and careful, qualities I believed were respected. I had a life mapped out quietly, meticulously, confident that if I stayed true to my principles, nothing could touch me. That was until the one person I trusted most chose to rewrite the rules without a word. It started subtly, with tiny decisions being made behind closed doors, emails sent that skirted me entirely, opportunities I had prepared for vanishing in an instant. At first I brushed it off as coincidence, as oversight, unwilling to believe that someone I considered a friend could be orchestrating my undoing. But the signs were undeniable, accumulating into a pattern so deliberate it became impossible to ignore. I realized, slowly, that the betrayal wasn't just professional, it was personal, surgical in precision, designed to cut deep without leaving a trace. I remember the day the betrayal fully revealed itself. I was hospitalized unexpectedly for a minor but serious procedure, and I had trusted her, my wife, the person I believed was my anchor, to handle everything in my absence. When I returned home, I discovered that she had sold my engagement ring, a symbol I had treasured more than gold, not for necessity but to fund her brother's extravagant, unnecessary indulgence. It was a punch that landed in silence. I didn't scream, I didn't shout. I just felt a slow, rising awareness that the foundation I had built with care was cracking beneath me. Her mother's words came like ice. She smirked, sharp and satisfied. "Thanks to the ring, your brother-in-law finally got what he deserved." I laughed, not from amusement, but from disbelief. She demanded, "What's so funny?" Her grin faltered when I calmly explained that the ring they had sold was the one I had designed specifically for her, the one with a secret engraving only I knew. The power in that small detail, a tiny piece of leverage that no one else understood, was mine alone. The shock on their faces was a revelation, not a victory but a spark. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Clarity. Anger would have been easy, loud, destructive, but I didn't want noise. I wanted precision. I wanted control. Watching them, realize, silently, that they had underestimated me, that their actions had given me quiet ammunition, stirred something inside me. There was a lesson here about trust, about appearances, and about the hidden strength of patience. And I began to see the path forward, not through confrontation, but through strategy. That night, I sat alone in my study, the ring safely back in my possession, my mind tracing every step, every misstep, every overlooked opportunity my betrayal had left behind. It wasn't about revenge for its own sake. It was about reclaiming power, asserting quiet justice, and restoring my equilibrium without chaos. The real story was just beginning. And it would unfold not in anger, not in shouts, but in the still, deliberate precision of a man who had learned that betrayal, when handled correctly, could be the most enlightening of teachers. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying every interaction, every casual conversation, every shared confidence, searching for the faintest hint I might have missed. Loyalty had always been my compass, the invisible rule that guided every decision, and yet, somehow, it had led me straight into a trap. I realized that trust, when given without observation, could become a weapon in someone else's hands. I wasn't naive, but I had been too comfortable, too confident in the quiet rhythms of my life to notice the subtle erosion happening right under my nose. I thought about the signs I had dismissed, those small moments that seemed inconsequential at the time. The hurried phone calls that stopped when I entered the room, the fleeting looks exchanged when decisions were made without me, the soft smiles that hid something else entirely. Each one had been a whisper of betrayal, A subtle nudge that I had ignored because I didn't want to believe that the people I loved could be capable of such calculated selfishness. Pain wrapped around me quietly, a cold companion that demanded I see the truth with unflinching clarity. What stung most wasn't the act itself, but the calm efficiency with which it had been carried out. There was no confrontation, no screaming accusation, only the empty spaces where trust had once lived. It forced me to examine my own assumptions, my own readiness to give without reservation. I realized that in my silence, in my patience, I had unknowingly created room for them to act without resistance. That realization was bitter, but it was also illuminating. The betrayal, though painful, had sharpened my perception in ways comfort never could. Late at night, I would lie awake, not with anger, but with a quiet, simmering calculation. I pictured every possible scenario, the dominoes of consequence that might fall if I acted with patience instead of impulse. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to make them feel fear in the moment. I needed leverage, the subtle, irreversible kind that comes not from confrontation, but from a deep understanding of weakness and opportunity. And in that silent meditation, I began to see the lines of power where I could step, where I could wait, where their arrogance would betray them further. I reflected on the people around me, the ones I had trusted blindly, and I realized how easily self-interest could masquerade as care. I felt sorrow, not for myself, but for them, because I understood that people who betray quietly are trapped in a version of life where manipulation is the only currency. Yet even in my sorrow, there was a strange sense of liberation. Betrayal had pried open my eyes, showing me the architecture of control and influence I had been blind to before. It was painful, but in that pain, there was clarity, and clarity is power. By the time the week ended, I had grown accustomed to the tension, to the quiet ache of knowing that someone close had undermined me. But I was no longer just reacting. I was observing, absorbing, and mapping the terrain with precision. Every word, every gesture, every assumed loyalty became a data point in a strategy I was forming. I knew that any response rooted in emotion would be squandered. Instead, I would act deliberately, invisibly, allowing the betrayer's own choices to set the stage for their undoing. Revenge, I realized, was not a spectacle. It was a quiet, inevitable consequence. The first step in reclaiming control was observation. I began to notice patterns I had never seen before. Habits, preferences, subtle vulnerabilities that had been hidden beneath the polished surface of betrayal. I didn't confront or accuse. I simply watched. I documented in my mind every interaction, every decision that suggested weakness or reliance on convenience. And I began to map a strategy that required patience rather than impulse. There was no rush, no need for drama. Every detail mattered, and every detail would eventually serve its purpose. I realized that leverage was not something I could force. It had to be discovered, nurtured, and applied with care. There were small things, almost trivial in isolation, that when combined, created a force so quiet yet undeniable that it could dismantle arrogance without a word. I found that the engagement ring, once a symbol of love, was a talisman of insight. The knowledge of what had been done, and the secrecy surrounding it, gave me a subtle but tangible edge. The betrayer had acted with confidence, assuming I would never notice, but that overconfidence became the foundation for my plan. Every interaction became an exercise in patience and subtle influence. I smiled when they expected irritation. I deferred when they expected confrontation. I let them reveal themselves in their own actions, overestimating their control, underestimating my observation. The quietness of my response was disarming. I wasn't just holding back, I was cultivating inevitability. Their misplaced confidence became my ally, And each careless assumption they made laid the bricks for a structure of quiet justice I was assembling, piece by piece. At work, I noticed how they relied on others to fill gaps in their knowledge, how their decisions often benefited the wrong people, and how their ego prevented them from seeing their own fragility. These discoveries were not for gossip or spite. They were data. I catalogued them, allowed them to unfold, and waited for the right moment when their overconfidence would collide with the truth. It was fascinating, almost hypnotic, to watch someone construct their own weakness without realizing it, to see their empire of assumptions crumble silently under the weight of its own design. The leverage I discovered extended beyond mere material value. Trust, influence, and perception became tools in my hands. I began to make small adjustments in my own behavior, subtle moves that went unnoticed but altered the equilibrium. A missed email here, a strategic absence there, a carefully measured observation of their reliance on others. It all contributed to a web that would eventually hold them accountable without my needing to raise my voice. I was patient, precise, and quietly relentless. By the end of this phase, I felt an unfamiliar satisfaction. It was not joy or vindication. It was control, the sweet certainty that when the time came, the consequences would unfold naturally, without spectacle, without chaos. I had discovered the power of silence, the influence of observation, and the strength that comes from understanding a situation more deeply than anyone else. I was no longer a passive victim of betrayal. I was a strategist, a quiet force waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the truth that would set everything right. The first subtle tremors of their unraveling began quietly, almost imperceptibly, but I noticed every shift. I didn't confront them, didn't accuse them, and didn't need to. My actions were invisible, yet deliberate, a series of small adjustments that disrupted their rhythm without anyone else noticing. The meetings they thought they controlled suddenly slipped into chaos. Their emails, once carefully crafted to assert dominance, were met with silence or ignored when strategically advantageous. It was mesmerizing to see someone unravel, not with confrontation, but with the inevitable consequences of their own arrogance. I had ensured that the right people were now quietly aware of the inconsistencies, the gaps, and the decisions that didn't add up. I never spoke directly to the betrayer about these revelations. Instead, I let patterns emerge, whispers circulate, and the truth take shape on its own. Their confidence, once absolute, began to falter as they sensed the shifting dynamics without understanding why. The tension in their gestures, the slight hesitation in speech, the overcompensation in meetings, it all indicated that my silent strategy was working. They were losing control, piece by piece, and they didn't even know it. The engagement ring had become more than a symbol. It was my quiet leverage. I had shared its story with a few key people, the ones whose opinions and judgment carried weight, without ever revealing the full scope of my awareness. Suddenly, the betrayer's actions were framed differently in the minds of others. Their credibility, carefully cultivated over years, was subtly questioned without a single accusation from me. I watched as they overanalyzed every decision, second-guessing themselves, unable to see that the invisible pressure came from the patience and calculation I had maintained all along. There was an elegance in the way this unfolded. The betrayer, so confident in their cunning, now relied on assumptions I had intentionally fed, choices that seemed advantageous but were actually traps. They were blindsided not by confrontation, but by the natural consequences of their own decisions, colliding with the subtle web I had woven. I remained calm, composed, and utterly indifferent on the surface. The quietness of my presence amplified the chaos around them. Each small victory of observation and subtle influence compounded into a growing sense of unease for them. What amazed me most was how little effort it required to dismantle someone so arrogant, when the timing and precision were right. I didn't raise my voice, didn't make threats, and didn't need to confront. I simply let their own momentum work against them, guiding the fallout like an invisible hand. The thrill wasn't in seeing them falter. It was in knowing that the natural consequences of their choices were being revealed without my interference. Every misstep, every misjudgment, every fragile attempt to regain control became a testament to the power of patience, planning, and observation. By the time the first real cracks appeared, I was already several moves ahead. I could see the panic behind the mask of composure, the hesitation behind the carefully curated smiles, the anxiety creeping into every gesture. They were no longer the orchestrator, they were the participant in a collapse they didn't understand, and I, the quiet observer, the one they had underestimated, was the only person in the room fully aware of how and why it was happening. The stage was set, the dominoes falling, and the victory would come not with noise, but with the silent satisfaction of inevitability. The shift was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but the betrayer's carefully constructed world began to collapse from within. Their confident demeanor cracked under scrutiny, the small mistakes they had ignored piling up until even they could no longer deny the consequences of their actions. I never raised my voice, never demanded explanations, and never dramatized their failures. I simply observed as their empire of overconfidence unraveled, each flaw magnified by the precision of the quiet pressure I had applied. It was fascinating to watch how people began to question what they had once accepted without thought. Those who had admired or relied on the betrayer started noticing discrepancies, inconsistencies that had previously been hidden behind charm and bravado. I allowed them to draw their own conclusions, and with each realization, the betrayer's control slipped further. I did not need to intervene. The weight of truth, combined with their own miscalculations, was enough to dismantle their carefully curated image. Every glance, every hesitation, every forced smile revealed the panic they couldn't suppress. I found no joy in their downfall, only a deep, satisfying calm. There is an elegance in justice that arrives quietly, naturally, without spectacle or noise. The betrayer had underestimated the power of observation and patience, and now the very arrogance that had driven their betrayal was ensuring their undoing. I watched as they tried desperately to maintain composure, but the cracks were too deep, the foundation too weak. Their world, once steady and unshakable, was now trembling in silence, as if acknowledging the inevitability of its collapse. At home, the same quiet justice played out in smaller personal ways. The decisions they had made, selling the ring, manipulating trust, echoed back on them. The same people they had sought to impress or manipulate now looked at them differently, aware of the subtle betrayals that had gone unnoticed. I didn't need to explain or expose. I simply maintained my presence, calm and composed, allowing them to feel the consequences of their choices without interference. There was no confrontation, no drama, only the steady truth settling into place, undeniable and persistent. I realized in that moment that true power doesn't roar, it whispers. The betrayer had thought that bold action and manipulation could secure control, but in reality the quiet patience of someone who understands consequence is infinitely more formidable. Every falter, every anxious glance, every miscalculation was a direct result of their own choices, colliding with the strategy I had crafted silently over weeks. I did not need to act aggressively. I simply remained constant, observant and deliberate, allowing natural justice to unfold. By the end, their collapse was complete. Not with spectacle, but with quiet inevitability. No one cheered, no known pointed fingers, yet the weight of accountability rested squarely on their shoulders. I felt a deep, calm satisfaction, not of vengeance, but of restoration. The scales had balanced themselves without noise, without confrontation, and without compromise to my integrity. It was a victory measured not in triumphal shouts, but in the quiet absolute certainty that truth and patience, when applied with care, are stronger than any betrayal. The silence after their collapse was almost deafening. No words were needed, no confrontations arranged, no explanations given. Everything had fallen into place naturally, and the quiet weight of inevitability hung in the air. I felt lighter than I had in months, freed not just from betrayal, but from the burden of having to fight or plead for justice. In those moments, I realized that the most profound victories are the ones you don't announce. They are the victories that transform you quietly internally, while the world around you adjusts to the consequences of its own mistakes. For the first time in a long while, I could breathe without calculating the next move, without analyzing the next hidden betrayal. I had reclaimed control of my life, my choices, and my peace of mind. The engagement ring sat in my drawer, a small symbol of the lessons learned and the quiet leverage that had shifted the balance. I didn't need it to assert dominance. I kept it as a reminder that even the smallest, overlooked details can wield enormous power if understood and applied wisely. I began to focus on myself, not on revenge or resentment. The betrayal had been a teacher in disguise, revealing the strength that comes from observation, patience, and emotional control. I cultivated new routines, re-established personal boundaries, and rebuilt relationships that were genuine and grounded in mutual respect. There was no rush, no need for dramatic gestures, just the quiet, deliberate shaping of a life that belonged entirely to me, untainted by manipulation or deceit. The betrayer faded from the central narrative of my life, no longer a threat, no longer a source of tension. I allowed them to exist on the periphery, observing the long-term consequences of their own choices without interference. Their failures were a mirror, reflecting what happens when arrogance and selfishness go unchecked. But I refused to let it consume me. My satisfaction came not from watching them suffer, but from knowing that truth, patience, and strategy had delivered justice without compromising my dignity. I embraced a sense of quiet freedom that had been absent for years. No longer defined by the betrayal, I discovered the subtle joys of living deliberately, without expectation or dependence on others' approval. Every decision I made was grounded in calm reflection rather than reactive emotion. Every interaction was measured, respectful, and intentional. The clarity that had emerged from pain became the foundation for a life that was steady, resilient, and unshakable. Finally, I understood the lesson in full. True power is not loud, and revenge is not always a spectacle. The deepest victories are earned in silence, guided by intellect, patience, and unwavering self-respect. As I looked out over the quiet rhythm of my life, I realized that I had not only survived betrayal, I had transformed it into a vehicle for growth, mastery, and control. And in that realization, I found peace, an unshakable calm, and the freedom that comes when you reclaim your life on your own terms. In the months that followed, I dedicated myself to rebuilding, not just my life, but the way I approached it. The betrayal had left a scar, yes, but it also left a clarity that no casual experience could provide. I began journaling every insight, mapping patterns of behavior, and learning to recognize subtle manipulations before they could take root. What once would have frustrated or destabilized me now became data, information I could use to navigate the world with calm precision. There was a strange liberation in turning pain into understanding. I restructured my daily routines to align with my values, reclaiming time that had been lost to anxiety and doubt. Early mornings became sacred spaces for reflection, meditation, and planning, while evenings were devoted to genuine connections, laughter, and meaningful work. The life I had once allowed others to influence subtly became my own entirely. Every small decision reinforced my independence and reminded me that control comes from patience, knowledge, and deliberate action, not from imposing will on others. Rebuilding trust in people was another challenge. I realized that loyalty is a rare commodity, one that must be nurtured, but also carefully measured. I surrounded myself with individuals who demonstrated consistency, integrity, and respect for boundaries. Each new relationship, whether personal or professional, became a deliberate choice rather than an assumption. I learned that discernment is a skill honed in silence, and that the quiet observation I had mastered during betrayal was now a tool for sustaining meaningful connections. I also discovered the importance of self-compassion. For years, I had been harsh with myself, blaming myself for oversights or trusting too deeply. But now, I understood that betrayal is not a reflection of weakness. It is a test of patience, resilience, and judgment. I forgave myself for what I had missed and celebrated the insight I had gained. Each day was a reaffirmation that I could navigate life with wisdom, applying lessons from past pain without carrying bitterness into my present. Professionally, I began applying the strategic patience I had learned to new challenges. Opportunities that had once been lost became stepping stones, and I approached negotiations, collaborations, and leadership with a quiet but unmistakable authority. Colleagues respected the calm control I exuded, sensing that I had endured, observed, and emerged stronger. My reputation transformed, not because I flaunted victories, but because consistency, clarity, and subtle influence spoke louder than words ever could. As I continued this journey, I noticed a profound internal shift. I no longer feared betrayal or loss, because I understood their mechanics and had mastered the power of response. The past was no longer a source of anxiety, but a source of wisdom. Each challenge became a test, not of my endurance, but of my ability to act strategically, silently, and deliberately. Life had become a series of choices, each weighted with intention and calm understanding, rather than reaction or impulse. Rebuilding trust after betrayal was not instantaneous. It was a careful, deliberate process that required observation, patience, and quiet courage. I no longer gave trust freely. I measured it in small increments, testing character through consistency rather than words. Every interaction became a subtle experiment in human behavior, revealing who acted with integrity and who concealed ulterior motives. The lessons from my past betrayal guided me, allowing me to differentiate between genuine loyalty and performative allegiance. I discovered that trust, once earned, became stronger than it had ever been, resilient and grounded in truth. I sought relationships that were reciprocal, not transactional. I surrounded myself with people who communicated openly, who respected boundaries, and who understood the quiet strength of discretion. In these relationships, I found joy in the subtle rhythms of companionship, shared silence, mutual understanding, and unspoken support. Unlike before, I did not allow need or obligation to dictate my choices. I had learned that true connection thrives, not in desperation, but in the careful cultivation of respect, observation, and shared values. In professional circles, the shift was equally transformative. I approached collaborations with measured engagement, weighing every partnership for alignment with both principle and purpose. I no longer overextended trust to those whose ambitions were self-serving. The calm vigilance I had developed during the betrayal became an asset. People noticed my reliability and quiet authority. Opportunities that had once seemed distant now aligned naturally with my values, as if the universe itself had rewarded the discipline and observation I had cultivated. Even in personal interactions, I applied the lessons subtly. I listened more than I spoke, noting patterns of speech, gestures, and intentions. I allowed others to reveal themselves through action rather than assuming loyalty based on appearances. Those who proved trustworthy became part of a circle defined not by convenience, but by mutual respect and shared understanding. Slowly, I discovered the beauty of connection built on observation, wisdom, and patience, the kind of bond that is resilient to deceit, manipulation, or betrayal. I also embraced the power of boundaries, realizing that respect for oneself is inseparable from respect from others. I no longer allowed intrusion, manipulation, or expectation to dictate my emotional state. Each interaction was framed by quiet control, deliberate choice, and an understanding of the balance between presence and distance. I discovered that calm detachment does not mean indifference. It means preserving clarity, perspective, and the ability to act with precision when necessary. By the end of this phase, I had created a new framework for trust, a carefully constructed network of relationships built on observation, integrity, and subtle understanding. I no longer feared betrayal because I had learned to anticipate it, navigate it, and transform its lessons into strength. In this quiet mastery, I found not only emotional resilience, but also a sense of empowerment that permeated every aspect of my life. The past no longer dictated my present. My discernment, patience, and intelligence did. With distance from the initial betrayal, I began to reflect deeply on the nature of power and loyalty. I realized that both are fragile when misused, yet enduring when grounded in principle and observation. True power is not domination or intimidation. It is subtle, quiet, and exercised with foresight. It is the patience to let events unfold, the intelligence to recognize opportunities, and the self-restraint to act deliberately. The betrayal had revealed how easily arrogance and self-interest could distort loyalty, and I carried that lesson forward in every choice I made. I observed people more critically, recognizing that human behavior is often a reflection of personal insecurity, ambition, or fear. Betrayal rarely arises from malice alone. It emerges from weakness, impatience, or misunderstanding. This perspective changed the way I interacted with others. Instead of reacting impulsively to perceived slights, I analyzed motives, patterns, and consequences. I discovered that when you approach relationships with calm scrutiny, the truth inevitably reveals itself, and decisions grounded in observation are far more reliable than those driven by emotion. Loyalty, I realized, is earned and maintained, not assumed. It thrives in an environment of respect, transparency, and mutual accountability. The betrayal had taught me that giving trust blindly can invite harm, but withholding it entirely breeds isolation. The balance lies in measured observation, small increments of faith, and a willingness to adjust based on evidence rather than emotion. The quiet mastery of this principle became one of my greatest sources of control and security in life. I also reflected on my own responses to betrayal, recognizing the power in restraint and strategic patience. Anger is fleeting, confrontation is often self-defeating, but measured action rooted in clarity has enduring consequences. The lessons I had learned allowed me to navigate not only personal relationships, but also professional dynamics with precision. I realized that influence grows quietly through consistency, understanding, and subtle guidance, rather than through spectacle or aggression. This reflection extended to my understanding of timing. Many people fail to act wisely because they rush, assuming that immediate reaction equals strength. I learned that timing is the most underestimated form of power. Waiting, observing, and letting others reveal themselves often yields outcomes far more decisive than any immediate action. The betrayal had forced me to cultivate patience as a weapon, and in doing so, I discovered an enduring form of mastery that no one could take from me. Finally, I internalized the lesson that emotional control is a form of freedom. By observing, understanding, and acting deliberately, I liberated myself from the chaos created by others' choices. I no longer needed to manipulate, argue, or confront. I simply aligned my actions with principle and allowed the natural consequences of human behavior to play out. In that calm, strategic space, I found an understanding of human nature, a mastery of influence, and a clarity of purpose that could withstand any betrayal, any deception, or any misjudgment. The first visible cracks in their professional life were almost poetic in their inevitability. Decisions that had once been celebrated as clever were now exposed as short-sighted, their overconfidence leaving a trail of errors that could not be ignored. I watched from a distance, never intervening directly, letting the momentum I had quietly set in motion carry the consequences to fruition. Each misstep was magnified by the very arrogance that had fueled the betrayal, and the respect they once commanded began to erode subtly but unmistakably. Financial miscalculations, which had always been hidden behind a veneer of control, became increasingly apparent. Budgets that had been manipulated, deals that had been overstated, and promises that could not be fulfilled began to collapse under scrutiny. Colleagues and partners, once loyal, started questioning judgment and competence. I remained calm, observing without comment, allowing the betrayer to face the inevitable fallout of decisions made without foresight or integrity. There was no need for interference. The framework had already been set. I noticed the subtle panic in their behavior as the walls of their professional empire closed in. Meetings became tense, presentations faltered, and the confidence they had so carefully displayed transformed into nervous overcompensation. Each attempt to regain control only highlighted the weaknesses I had long identified. I remained composed, a quiet observer, watching as the consequences of arrogance, selfishness, and betrayal unfolded with surgical precision. The contrast between my own stability and their unraveling became apparent to those around us. I maintained my composure, my work, and my credibility, and this calm authority further amplified the betrayer's decline. Colleagues began to notice who was truly reliable, who could navigate challenges with clarity and resilience. My silence became a powerful tool, casting the betrayer's failures in stark relief without a single word from me. As the months passed, the financial and professional repercussions became undeniable. Opportunities that had once been within their grasp slipped away quietly but consistently. Contracts, collaborations, and investments faltered under their mismanagement, and their reputation, carefully curated for years, became tarnished by the subtle truth that no one needed to announce it simply revealed itself. I did not celebrate this downfall. I did not gloat. I observed, learned, and allowed justice to occur through the natural outcome of their own choices. By the end of this phase, it was clear to everyone that the betrayer's world had shifted irreversibly. Their confidence, control, and influence were no longer intact, and the consequences of their actions reverberated in every interaction. Meanwhile, I remained untouched by panic, deception, or fear. My position strengthened by clarity, patience, and deliberate action. The lesson was simple yet profound. Betrayal might appear powerful in the moment, but quiet strategy, observation,